There are no coaching changes with the Jets on the first day of the offseason. We'll talk about it. In addition, Quinnen Williams wants a new contract, and the Jets get some good injury news. All this and more on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, January 10th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. Again, that's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, the season is over for the New York Jets. It ended Sunday in Miami with a loss. The Jets ended the season on a 6-game losing streak. An understandably unhappy fan base. Many fans were looking for big changes from the organization, and at least on the first day of the offseason, they did not get them. The Jets cleaned out their lockers yesterday. There was plenty of talk, plenty of players and coaches, and even Joe Douglas going to the media talking about the season that was and what lies ahead, but there were no changes. And I cannot say I'm surprised. Despite all of that talk about Woody Johnson being really unhappy, it always felt to me like they were going to give this crew another season. Joe Douglas spoke to the media. I don't think Joe Douglas said anything particularly noteworthy. He gave you a lot of the GM speak. Robert Saleh also spoke to the media, gave you a little bit more, and we'll talk about what he said in a bit. But the Jets don't even announce any changes below Saleh. No changes to the coordinators, no changes to the position coaches. Now, one thing I will note, though, is while you frequently hear about general manager and head coach changes on Black Monday, and Black Monday is the day after the regular season ends, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for assistants to move out. So it's still possible we could see a change on the Jets coaching staff, especially when we talk about the lower level guys, the position coaches. It's not even inconceivable the Jets could make a coordinator change. So just because it doesn't happen on Monday, doesn't mean it's everybody's safe right now. Robert Saleh has been focusing on the upcoming opponent more than he's been focusing on changes he's going to make to his staff. I'm sure he's been thinking through maybe some things he wanted to do in the offseason, but likely he needs a couple of days to really figure out what changes, if any, he wants to make. Now, of course, everybody could be back next year. That's also possible. Now, I look at this from the perspective of, should the Jets have made a change with Joe Douglas? Should they have made a change with Robert Saleh? I would lean toward no in both cases, and I kind of laid it out yesterday, but I'll explain to you why I feel that way again. The Jets, essentially, this offseason, they'll make some changes. They'll have some cap space. It's not going to be a dire cap situation, but they spent almost 2 years' worth of money last offseason. They were very, very aggressive in free agency, and when you're that aggressive in free agency, you're essentially locking in your roster for 2 years going forward. So I look at this, you're essentially going to have more or less the same roster with some changes here or there, and obviously the quarterback situation is one spot where we could look for a major change, but it's almost like what they did last year. Is that they set up a 2-year window, and you got to see this through, and I think next year would be a pretty natural point if you're going to make a change to make it. So next year we can see what happens, and if they make the playoffs next year, you can bring everybody back and you can start talking about contract extensions. But if things fail next year, well, that'll be really 4 years for Joe. I know it's technically his 5th year. That'll really be 4 years for Joe Douglas and 3 years since he really had a chance to shape the roster in his image. It'll be 3 years for Robert Saleh. If the Jets, don't make progress next year, That's a pretty logical point, because then that'll be a point where the Jets will be able to hit the reset button. They'll be able to make moves that they want to make. They'll be able to enter the offseason with big resources. They'll once again have a lot of cap space. So next year is more of a natural jumping off point. Now, sometimes you need to make a change before the natural jumping off point. I know the season ended poorly, but I still think they made progress. Now, they showed, I would say that, if you'd asked me before the season, this would be the minimal amount of progress they could have shown for me to endorse them returning. But I think one more year makes sense to me. I'm not saying you extend them. And I think part of the issue is people act like that unless there's firing, there's no accountability. Well, I don't agree with that, because there's a difference between entering next year on the hot seat with everybody and everybody feeling good because they made the playoffs. If the Jets had made the playoffs, people would have gotten contract extensions. They would have been safe next year. Next year, they're entering the year on the hot seat. And so I don't agree with the idea that this shows a lack of accountability, because there's a price that's been paid. These guys are entering next year with their jobs in danger. Now, when we talk about the offensive coordinator, Mike LaFleur, I could have gone either way, to be honest with you. I don't think LaFleur has shown himself to be a genius offensive mind. I don't think he's shown himself to be the next great offensive coach in the NFL. So if they wanted to make a change, I was fine with that. At the same time, LaFleur gets an awful lot of blame for things that I don't think are his fault. When you get the level of quarterback play the Jets got this year, almost no offensive coordinator is going to look good. When you have all these injuries on the offensive line, I've heard people say, LaFleur runs the quote-unquote Shanahan system. You need to have great offensive line play. Well, name me a system where you don't need offensive line play that's going to work with bad offensive line play. There aren't really many out there. So I'm giving you, I think that, again, one of the issues is that I think that there's this perception out there, if you're saying you bring the guy back for one more year, you're saying that you approve of the job that they did. I don't really approve of the job the Jets coaches did, especially down the stretch this year. I just think that, we can give this one more year. Now, Saleh made an interesting comment. It was one of the few non-coach speak things Saleh said yesterday when he addressed the press, and that's that the Jets are going to probably look to bring in a veteran coach. And to me, that's kind of logical. Now, last year in the offseason, the Jets, they let Matt Cavanaugh go, who was kind of the veteran coach on the staff. And Cavanaugh replaced Greg Knapp, who was originally hired by the Jets to be a senior offensive assistant. And you may remember he tragically died in a horrible accident before the Jets season last year. And they brought in Matt Cavanaugh, and they actually brought in Zach Wilson's personal coach, John Beck, during the season. So Jets had a lot of offensive coaches last year in 2021. After the season, Matt Cavanaugh did not return. John Beck did not return. Jets had less coaches. And, all last offseason I heard about how, it was going to be beneficial for Zach Wilson because there were too many cooks in the kitchen last year. And we saw how well that worked out this year. I think sometimes we lean into these narratives where more coaches is good, less coaches is good. It depends on the situation. It depends on the people involved. There are cases where more coaches is beneficial to a team. There are probably there are cases where less coaches are beneficial. It depends on the specific people involved, the specific people in the mix. But I will say this. When you look back to the original plan, it was to pair Mike LaFleur with Greg Knapp, who was a veteran coach. And I think when you look at the last 2 years of LaFleur, one thing that sticks out to me, I think he gets blamed for a lot of things that are not his fault, but I think one criticism that I do have of him is sometimes he gets a little too clever for his own good. I think sometimes, he's a young, inexperienced guy, and he struggles to channel his aggression and play calling. Sometimes he gets a little bit too creative for his own good. And I think a coach like LaFleur, who really hasn't done this before, could benefit from having like an older, more experienced hand with him as a sounding board. Now, it doesn't guarantee anything, and I think I don't want to go through the offseason acting like if the Jets hire some veteran coach, everything's going to be fixed. Because it's not, because they got to fix the quarterback position. That's more important than anything else. But I do think bringing a veteran coach in is probably a good thing. And the name that's been floated would be a phenomenal hire for the Jets, Gary Kubiak, who has been one of the best offensive minds in the NFL of the last, I would say, 3 decades. If the Jets could bring in Gary Kubiak to work with LaFleur, if the Jets, honestly, if you brought in a Gary Kubiak, you may even make him the guy that's in charge of the offense. LaFleur could keep the offensive coordinator title. And you give Kubiak a title like, senior offensive assistant or whatever, but things run through Kubiak. and LaFleur could like expose him to new ideas, but Kubiak would, that's something that could make sense. But it sounds like, for at least for now, the status quo is going to remain on the Jets coaching staff. Stay tuned, of course, but it doesn't sound like the Jets are making many major changes. We'll find out in the days ahead whether that actually proves to be the case. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue to talk about developments from locker cleanout day. The best player on the team wants a new contract. It's not a surprise, and the Jets should give it to him. Quinnen Williams' contract situation is our topic as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. The Jets season might be over, but there are still playoff games ahead. You can still play daily fantasy, and PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 5 players. If they score more or less than the PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you against the projections available, and it goes beyond the NFL. You can use PrizePicks projections on any sport that you watch. So NBA, NHL, college football, which is over now, men's and women's college basketball. You can do even disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy. They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they are currently operational in over 30 states and in Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you another $50. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you $100. And don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. Thanks again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. The NFL playoffs are beginning, so subscribe to the Locked On NFL podcast and get daily conversations on the biggest NFL stories. Plus in-depth analysis from the biggest games in the NFL, key predictions every Friday, and on Monday, local insiders cover the weekend with game-to-game episodes. Locked On NFL, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And today we're talking about the Jets. Their season's over. They cleaned out their lockers yesterday. Plenty of players, plenty of coaches spoke to the press. One of the players who spoke to the press was Quinnen Williams, the best player on the team, guy who had, by all accounts, a breakout season. A guy who, if he doesn't make All-Pro, that would be the biggest, in my view, travesty involving Jets postseason honors since Charles Woodson won the Defensive Player of the Year over Darrelle Revis in 2009. Quinnen Williams deserves to be an All-Pro. Quinnen Williams is also entering the final year of his rookie contract. The Jets last offseason picked up his 5th-year option. So the Jets have it for one more year, but beyond 2023, it's unclear what's going to happen with Quinnen Williams. And Quinnen Williams expressed that he wants to remain a member of the New York Jets, and he even put a time frame on when he wants a new contract. He said he wants a new contract by the beginning of the offseason program. Now, if he does not get a new contract by the beginning of the offseason program, one might guess that that implies he may skip the offseason program. And this happens a lot when you deal with players who are looking for new contracts because these players don't really have a lot of leverage in these deals. The offseason program, however, aside from there's one mini camp at the end of the offseason program that's mandatory, but the rest of the offseason program is purely voluntary. So what you see frequently is when a player wants a new contract, he kind of expresses his frustration by not showing up to the offseason program because there's no punishment, there's no fine because it's voluntary. It's purely voluntary. The players don't need to come. And frequently this creates, a lot of headlines. And frankly, it tends to be overrated, especially for a player like a Quinnen Williams, who he's developed. Quinnen Williams doesn't really need the offseason program. He knows how to get ready for the season. And, the offseason program happens in the spring, so it's not like a distraction in the spring really impacts a football team. So these situations where a player skips the offseason program tends to lead to a lot of panic, a lot of big headlines in the media. It doesn't really mean a whole lot. The Jets could avoid a distraction, I guess, if they sign Quinnen, but that really should not be their motivation. Their motivation should be to sign their best player to a contract extension. And this is something that's been an issue in the Woody Johnson era. I don't know if it's directly because of Woody. It may not be. But the Jets have always had these acrimonious negotiations with their star players. And sometimes they lose them. But even when they re-sign these guys, it tends to take longer. It tends to create more heartache than it should. I could go all the way back to the offseason after the 2002 season with Lavernius Coles, when the Jets let him leave for Washington as a restricted free agent. Now, I don't know if that was necessarily an acrimonious negotiation, but they lost a guy who was an ascending star player, and there really was no justification for it. And I could go through the list, Darrelle Revis, twice, really. back in 2010 when the Jets signed him after a holdout. 2013 when they traded him rather than re-signing him. You could go through, and some of these guys the Jets were better off getting rid of. Jamal Adams, things were very acrimonious, and they traded him. They got rid of him. Jets would have been better off getting rid of Muhammad Wilkerson back in 2016 based on how things turned out, but that turned into a very acrimonious negotiation. The Jets need to just get this done already. And this has been an issue with the Jets for years. They haven't even been able to get their draft picks into training camp on time. In fact, Quinnen Williams was a holdout because of an issue over like the timing of a bonus payment. It never made any sense. The Jets pick really weird spots to draw lines in the sand with their impact players. And it's been one of those frustrating things because you look at free agency, the Jets have frequently not shown much restraint through the years in spots where they really should have. And you can go through the contracts that they've given out. But even last year, in retrospect, those contracts they give out to the tight ends were ridiculous for the roles that tight ends played in the offense. And I'm not even talking, performance is one thing. For the role these guys played in the offense, I don't understand why they paid so much to these tight ends last year, because it's not like they were particularly important players in the scheme. When they signed them, I figured the Jets were going to adjust their offense. It was going to be a tight end-centric offense. It really was not. So my point being, the Jets really throw money around in spots where it doesn't make sense, but in the important players, guys like first-round picks, guys like impact players, they suddenly get very fiscally conservative. They suddenly really care about every last penny. And it's important to have some degree of restraint when you're running a football team, of course. I mean, if you've been a long-time listener, you know that I've been very frustrated at points where the Jets have not shown fiscal restraint at points where they should have. But this is not a spot where you necessarily fight to the very last dollar. You need to get Quinnen Williams locked up. I'm not saying you give Quinnen Williams whatever he wants. I'm not saying you give Quinnen Williams a blank check. But I think it's important for this player to remain a member of the New York Jets over the long run. And I think it's important for the Jets to keep this guy around. And people always talk about sending a message to the locker room that if you play well, you're going to get paid. I think that matters. But I think the most important reason to re-signing Quinnen Williams is far more tangible. He's a great player. You want this great player on your team. You don't want to be giving up a great player to somebody else. We've reached at some point you got to keep your great players, and the Jets have not done that well enough. The Jets have had few great players in recent years, but far too frequently they've been allowed to leave this team after their contract expires because they couldn't work out a new deal. It's time for the Jets to keep a guy who's a homegrown star on this roster because he was obviously one of the driving forces behind the defensive improvement this year. It's funny because there were plenty of areas you can look to. The corners were much better this year, but some of the biggest improvements the Jets had on defense were internal. And that's Quinnen Williams going from good player to great player, a guy who became a bona fide star, a guy who played at an all-pro level. And I said this before last year. I felt like even before Quinnen Williams' breakout, this was a guy the Jets should have re-signed. And if they had maybe worked on an extension and been a little bit more proactive, they may have a bargain contract on their hands. Now, I'm lying if I told you that I was expecting this kind of year from Quinnen. I was not. But you guess at some point, you gotta, if you have a guy who fits your system really well, you got to bring him back. So I hope that the Jets are proactive here. I hope they're not waiting until late into the summer. I hope this doesn't drag on. I hope this doesn't become acrimonious, just because we don't really need that. We all know Quinnen should be back. We all know the Jets should try and make a deal with him to keep him a Jet for a very long time. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out this episode. And we're going to talk about some injury updates. A couple players coming off season-ending injuries gave the Jets some good news. Breece Hall and Elijah Vera Tucker. Can we expect them back for training camp? Find out as we continue this Tuesday episode of the podcast. Well, the Jets season is over, but of course there's lots of great playoff football action this weekend. So even if you can't root for the Jets, maybe you can make some money. And you should know that BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get all of the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to basketball to hockey. They've got it all at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, well, of course you love sports podcasts. You're listening to Locked On Jets. Well, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They are the fastest and easiest way to get all of your betting info. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. Yesterday was a little clean-out day for the Jets. Jets cleaned out their lockers and the media was there, so many Jets players spoke to the press. And a couple players mentioned that they're expecting to be back by the beginning of training camp. And notably, those players were Breece Hall and Elijah Vera Tucker. Two players who were kind of connected this year for the Jets because the first half of the season, they were probably the two best players the Jets had on offense and the two most important players for different reasons. Breece Hall became the go-to guy, especially as the month of October arrived, and he got off to a bit of a slow start. In fact, I remember going back to the preseason, Breece Hall had a rough game against Atlanta when the Jets played almost their entire backup offensive line. It's almost like the fan base checked out on Breece Hall. It was almost like they said, well, this guy's nothing special. Now, of course, he's running behind an offensive line that was full of backups. Although you could argue that's what he was doing in the regular season and playing much better. But it's almost like people forgot about Breece Hall. And, the opener against Baltimore, he looked decent, but he had a fumble. But every week he started to get a little bit better and a little bit better the following week. And then finally he had his breakout game against the Miami Dolphins week 5. And the next 3 weeks, he was one of the best offensive players in the league. Not just one of the best backs in the league, but one of the best offensive players in the league. He became an explosive presence for the Jets at a point where they were really struggling in the passing game. He was the guy who kept the offense afloat. Unfortunately, he got injured, suffered a knee injury against the Denver Broncos. And in that same game, the Jets lost Elijah Vera Tucker to an elbow injury. And Vera Tucker was important because he was a guy who was moving around. This is the amazing thing about Elijah Vera Tucker this year. He played 3 different positions on the offensive line. None of them were the position he played last year, because last year he was the Jets' left guard. After the signing of Laken Tomlinson, Vera Tucker moved to right guard, but then injuries forced him to move around. He moved to left tackle for a game against the Steelers. Then Dwayne Brown came back, so Vera Tucker shifted over to right tackle. He played well at all the spots. And looking forward, the Jets really have question marks at both tackle positions, and they may have stumbled onto something with Vera Tucker, how well he played. And there's going to be a question, and we'll talk a lot about it in the offseason. There's a difference between a guy who can maybe handle the tackle spot for a game or 2 or 3, but maybe gets exposed over the longer haul, versus a guy who can play tackle in the NFL. And we'll have to try and figure out, and the Jets will have to try and figure out whether he can do that. But maybe they stumbled onto something. And if they did, it's really helpful because this tackle position is kind of up in the air for the Jets. Unfortunately, though, Vera Tucker suffered an injury in that Denver game. It was an elbow injury, and he also was lost for the season. So the Jets lost their 2 best players on the offense in one game. Now, of course, as the season progressed, Garrett Wilson became arguably a top 2 player on the offense. I would say go beyond arguably. Garrett Wilson became one of the 2 best players on offense as the season progressed. But at the time of the injury, it was Hall and it was Vera Tucker. And it's very good news for the Jets that it sounds like they're going to have both of them back by the start of training camp. Now, and I'm not a doctor, but I think there's more questions around Hall than there are around Vera Tucker. Once Vera Tucker comes back, you'll expect him to be the same guy. With Hall, of course, coming back from a knee injury at the running back position, there are questions of how quickly he's going to look like himself again, because you see this every year. Sometimes there's a skill player who comes back from an injury, and he's healthy enough to be back in the lineup, but he hasn't fully recovered, and the explosion's not all there. And depending on what the Jets do this offseason at the quarterback position and at wide receiver and even offensive line, Hall continues to be a critical player for the Jets. In fact, I've said this many times. During that 3-game stretch, Miami, Green Bay, Denver, you could take it a step beyond saying he was the best player on the Jets offense. Because in many ways, he was the offense in those games. Games where, and this was part of Zach Wilson's stretch where he really struggled. Breece Hall was the guy who kept the Jets offense afloat. And, you wonder how differently this season would have gone if Breece Hall hadn't gotten hurt. And, it's one of those things, you don't want to go too far into it because everybody has injuries. At the same time, injuries do impact football teams. And some injuries hurt you more than others. And Breece Hall's injury was a huge deal for the Jets this season. And if he had stayed healthy, I think things would have gone differently. I think a lot would have gone differently. And, maybe Zach Wilson would have been able to keep his spot in the lineup, because once Hall left the lineup, the passing game had to carry more of the load. When Breece Hall was in there, the Jets did not really need to get a lot from their passing game to win games. And, of course, there were other factors in there. The defensive play was obviously a factor. Frankly, the quarterbacks the Jets played were also a factor, made that defense's job a heck of a lot easier. But having Breece Hall in there to just kind of take the load, a running back like a Breece Hall can be a young quarterback's best friend, because essentially what he can do is first of all, in that Miami game, he provided 100 yards of his own in the as a receiver. So that was a huge deal. But beyond that, it makes life so much easier, because young quarterback's not going to be in bad downs and distances, and you don't need to drop your young quarterback to scan the entire field 30 times a game when you can just hand it off and have a successful play, because your back's going to be able to do the job. So lots that the Jets leaned on for Breece Hall this past season, and unfortunately they lost him at a point where they really could not afford to lose him. And that Denver victory was kind of even though the Jets won the game in the long run, and I think we all kind of felt it at the time, that it could be the kind of win that brought a bigger loss to the Jets, and it really did, because even though the Jets won that game to go to 5-2, they were never really the same again, especially on the offensive side of the football. So it's good that Breece Hall will be back. Of course, the question will be, will he look like the Breece Hall we saw in Denver and in Green Bay and in Miami, or is that going to take more time? And we'll find that out months from now. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review if you're listening on a podcast source, or a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will have our weekly mailbag, unless there's major news that breaks. We may push the mailbag to Thursday then, but either way, we'll have a mailbag this week. Send in your questions.